Welcome back to the deep dive where we help you become the best Airbnb host you can be.
Mm.
Today we're diving into a question that might seem small, but can really make a difference to your reviews.
Oh, yeah.
Coffee?
Um,
Specifically, do you need to provide it even if you don't want to?
hmm. It's so interesting how this seemingly simple amenity can be such a sticking point for some people. It really gets at the heart of what guests expect versus a host's own personal choices.
Right. We actually had a host, Michelle, reach out because she was wrestling with this exact dilemma. She's put a lot of thought into making her rental as ego-friendly as possible,
Yeah.
and she just personally prefers a French press over a pod-based coffee maker
Yeah.
because of the waste.
I see.
But then she got a negative review from a guest who complained about there not being a coffee maker,
Wow.
even though it wasn't listed as an amenity.
Oh, that's interesting. That's a pretty common scenario. I
Yeah.
think guests just come in with these baseline assumptions about what will be included, even if it's not like clearly written out. We can almost think of it as like a minimum viable amenity, those things guests generally expect to find.
So is coffee officially on that list? Like, is it a must-have, even if you don't put it on the listing?
It's definitely in that gray area, I'd say. While most guests aren't going to expect you to have like a top of the line espresso machine,
Right.
the ability to just make some kind of coffee first thing in the morning is often seen as pretty standard.
Which puts hosts like Michelle in a tough spot. She's trying to be environmentally conscious,
Mm.
but now she's worried that if she sticks to her principles, it might cost her bookings.
It's all about finding that balance, isn't it?
Yeah.
Respecting your own values, but still making sure your guests have a good experience. And honestly, it's not just about coffee either. This applies to other amenities too. Like think about basic toiletries or cooking supplies or even Wi-Fi.
Yeah.
Guests may not always specifically say they need those things, but they definitely factor into how happy they are overall.
So how do we figure out what those minimum viable things are? Is there a list somewhere?
Well, there's no like official list.
Yeah.
But it's kind of a combination of looking at trends in the industry and paying attention to what your guests are saying in their reviews and just knowing your target market.
Ah.
Like what might be totally essential for someone traveling for work could be completely different for a family who's on vacation.
Right. Okay. That makes sense. So let's go back to Michelle and her situation.
Yeah.
What are some ways she could deal with this whole coffee issue?
Well, there's a couple different paths she could take. She could decide to just go ahead and provide a coffee maker,
Okay.
but choose an option that fits with her values, maybe a simple energy efficient model,
Yeah.
or even invest in a high quality instant coffee setup.
Those are good ideas.
Oh,
But I'm thinking some hosts might be hesitant to buy something they don't even use themselves. Is there any way around that, like
Yeah.
without adding another appliance?
for sure. Clear communication is really key here. Michelle could put it right in her listing description that there's no coffee maker. That way, guests know what to expect from the beginning, and it might help to attract the kinds of guests who are okay with that.
Right.
She could even suggest some good local cafes or coffee shops in the area, like in her welcome guide, almost making the lack of coffee in the room an excuse to go out and explore.
Ooh, I love that. Turning a potential negative into a positive.
Exactly. It's all about framing and just being upfront with your guests.
Now, some people might think that not offering coffee at all is like a deal breaker. Are there hosts out there who are successfully doing that?
Mm.
Or did Michelle's experience prove that's not going to work?
Oh, definitely. There are absolutely hosts who choose not to provide coffee and still get amazing reviews. It really does go back to setting those expectations, like we were saying. And some guests actually prefer it. They like that the host is being eco-conscious and focusing on other parts of the experience.
Ah, that's interesting. It's cool to see how different hosts have different priorities.
Exactly. There's really no one right way to be a great host on Airbnb. It's all about finding what works best for you and your property.
All right, so we've talked about those minimum viable amenities and how coffee can be a tricky one. And we've looked at some things Michelle could do, from getting an eco-friendly coffee maker to just being honest about not having one. What other things should hosts keep in mind when they're making this decision?
Well, there's the practical stuff too, right? Like how much space do you actually have? What's your budget for all these extras? And how much extra cleaning are you willing to do?
Oh yeah, a coffee maker is just one more thing to clean.
Exactly. And it's also about who you're trying to attract. Like, are your typical guests the kind of people who are up at the crack of dawn and need their coffee right away? Or are they more laid back and maybe happy to like wander out to a cafe?
So it's not just about having an amenity, it's about having the right amenity for the right guest.
You got it. It always goes back to figuring out your niche and what you're offering.
Okay, so let's say a host does decide to get a coffee maker. What are some tips for picking one that's good for the guests, but also good for the planet?
Okay, so first you got to think about the size. Like if you usually have couples or single travelers, a little single-serve brewer might be all you need. But for bigger groups, you'll want something that can make a bunch of cups at once.
And then there's the whole energy efficiency thing, too.
Right. You definitely want to look for models that have that automatic shut-off feature to save energy. And if you're worried about waste, get a machine that doesn't need paper filters.
Yeah.
Some of them even have those built-in reusable filters.
Speaking of waste, we got to talk about those little pods.
Yeah.
Super convenient, but so much trash.
Uh-huh.
Are there any eco-friendly options out there?
You know there are. Some companies make pods that you can compost, and you can even get reusable ones that you fill up with your own coffee.
So you can still have that pod convenience without totally trashing the environment.
Yep. This takes a little bit of extra research.
And the coffee itself. Choosing sustainably sourced beans can make a big difference too, can't it?
Absolutely. Look for certifications like Fair Trade or Organic or Rainforest Alliance. Stuff like that just means the coffee was grown in a way that protects the environment and treats workers fairly. And getting whole beans and grinding them yourself is not only tastier, but also cuts down on packaging.
Okay, so we've talked about machines and pods and beans. What else should hosts be thinking about when they're trying to make a more eco-friendly coffee setup?
Think about all the little things, like giving guests reusable mugs instead of disposable cups,
All right.
and maybe even a milk frother if that's something your guests would like.
Oh, yeah.
And, of course, having a recycling bin that's clearly labeled just for those coffee grounds and compostable pods.
Yeah, those little touches that show you're really putting in the effort.
For sure. And what about those hosts who just decide not to provide a coffee maker? How can they make sure their guests understand and avoid getting bad reviews?
That's a good question.
I mean, the key is to be really clear and upfront about it. You got to put it right in the listing description. Something like, we don't have a coffee maker in the suite, but there's an amazing cafe just a block away. You can even include some pictures of the cafe to make it look tempting.
That's a good idea.
Yeah, turn it into a positive. Like, encourage people to check out the neighborhood and find some hidden gems. You could even give them a discount card or a coupon for a nearby cafe.
It's like taking something that could be a negative and flipping it around.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And remember, honesty is the best policy. If you're honest about what you have and don't have from the get-go, you'll attract the right kind of guests.
Okay, so we've covered a lot here. From choosing eco-friendly coffee makers to finding good beans to communicating with your guests.
Yeah.
But there's one more big thing we haven't talked about yet, the money side of it.
Oh, yeah, that's a good point.
How can hosts make sure their coffee setup is affordable while still being sustainable and keeping their guests happy?
That's the big question, isn't it? Like, how do you find that sweet spot where everyone's happy, your guests, the environment, and your wallet? It all starts with figuring out how much things are really costing you.
So breaking it all down.
Right.
Not just the price of the coffee maker itself, but also the filters, cleaning supplies, even electricity.
Exactly. Like, let's say you go with one of those pod systems.
Uh-huh.
Those pods can get expensive fast, especially if you're hosting a whole family.
Yeah.
One idea is to just give them a couple pods for free to get them started,
Yeah.
and then suggest they bring their own if they're going to want more than that.
That's a smart way to save money without seeming cheap.
And you can use it as a chance to talk about sustainability.
Okay.
You could say something like, we're trying to be mindful of waste, so feel free to bring your favorite pods if you're going to be drinking a lot of coffee.
It's like you're inviting them to be part of the solution.
Exactly. And honestly, sometimes less is more.
Okay.
You don't have to offer every kind of coffee under the sun. Focus on quality over quantity. Get one really good blend that your guests will love. Even if you don't have some fancy machine, a really delicious cup of coffee can make a big difference.
It goes back to knowing your guests. Like if you're hosting budget travelers, they might be totally fine with a simple setup and some good instant coffee.
Exactly. It's all about matching what you offer to what your guests are looking for. And don't forget about the little extras. They can go a long way.
Like what?
Like a little handwritten note about the coffee you chose, or a jar of those fancy biscottis you can get at the bakery down the street. Little things like that can make the experience feel special without costing you a fortune.
It's those little things that people remember.
For sure. Now, we've talked a lot about what kind of coffee to offer,
Yeah.
but what about how you talk about it? Like in your listings and when you're messaging with guests? Are there ways to talk about coffee that can help prevent problems and avoid bad reviews?
Absolutely. Being clear and simple is really important. If you do provide a coffee maker, tell them exactly what kind it is and what comes with it. like filters, sugar creamer, that kind of stuff.
Hmm.
And if you don't provide coffee, just be upfront about it and tell them what the alternatives are.
Yeah.
Like you could say, while we don't have a coffee maker in the unit, we're happy to provide a French press if you'd like. And there's a great cafe just around the corner. Something
Right.
like that.
It gives them options without making it seem like they're missing out.
Right. It just shows you're thinking about them.
Right.
And you can even take pictures of your coffee setup or the cafe and put them right in the listing.
Okay.
Pictures can really help set the right expectations.
It's like giving them a preview so there are no surprises.
Exactly. And you should do the same thing in your welcome guide and when you message with guests.
Okay. Put your coffee policy right in the welcome guide and give them clear instructions on how to use the coffee maker. If you have any specific things you want them to do, like composting the grounds or throwing the pods away properly, just tell them nicely and clearly.
It's all about making it easy for them to do the right thing.
Yep. And remember, talking to your guests shouldn't stop once they arrive. Encourage them to give you feedback. Ask them if they like the coffee and if there's anything you could do better. That kind of open conversation can help you figure out what works best and make sure you're keeping everyone happy.
So to sum it all up, we've talked about a lot of different things when it comes to coffee in an Airbnb. From the ethics and the environmental stuff to the practical stuff and the money side of it.
Yeah, it really is about finding what works for you, your property, and your guests, and it's a lot to think about.
Yeah.
But the goal is to create a coffee setup that checks all those boxes, makes your guests happy, is good for the planet, and doesn't break the bank.
Okay, so let's break it down. What are some practical things hosts can do to make that happen?
Well, first things first, you got to know your numbers. Like, actually sit down and calculate how much this whole coffee thing is costing you. Not just the coffee maker itself, but everything that goes with it, the coffee filters, cleaning, supplies, all of it.
Right, all those hidden costs.
Exactly. And then once you have a clear picture of your expenses, you can start looking for ways to save.
I see.
Like, let's take those single-serve pods, for example. They're convenient, but they can really add up, especially if you have guests who are big coffee drinkers.
Yeah, for sure.
So one thing you could do is provide a few pods for free, like a little welcome gift, and then let your guests know that if they're planning on having more than a cup or two, they might want to bring their own pods.
Okay, that makes sense. It's a nice gesture, but it also sets some boundaries.
Exactly. And it gives you a chance to talk about sustainability.
Yeah.
You can say something like, we're trying to be mindful of our environmental impact, so we encourage guests to bring their favorite pods if they plan on having multiple cups of coffee.
It's a win-win.
Mm.
Everyone's happy.
Exactly. And sometimes less is more. You don't need to offer every type of coffee imaginable. Focus on quality over quantity. Invest in a really good coffee blend that guests will love. Even if you don't have a fancy espresso machine, a delicious cup of coffee can really make a difference.
That's so true. And it goes back to understanding your target market. If you're catering to budget-conscious travelers, they might be perfectly happy with a simple setup and some high-quality instant coffee.
Absolutely. It's all about aligning your offerings with guest expectations, and those little extras can really make a big difference too.
Like what kind of extras?
Well, think about things like a handwritten note about the coffee you've chosen, or a small jar of locally made biscotti. Those thoughtful touches can create a memorable experience without breaking the bank.
It's all about those little details that make people feel special.
Exactly. Now, we've talked a lot about what kind of coffee to provide, but let's talk about how you communicate that to your guests, like in your listings and in your messages.
Okay, communication is key, right?
Right. Absolutely. Be clear and concise in your listing description. If you're providing a coffee maker, state what kind it is and what's included, like filters, sugar creamer, and so on. If you're not providing coffee, be upfront about it and offer alternatives.
Okay.
Like you could say, while we don't have a coffee maker in the unit, we're happy to provide a French press upon request. And there's a fantastic cafe just around the corner. Something like that.
I like that. It gives them options without making them feel like they're missing out.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it shows you've put some thought into their experience. You can even include photos of your coffee setup or the local cafe in your listing. Photos are a great way to set expectations.
Yeah, people really respond to visuals.
And don't forget to carry that same transparency over into your welcome guide and other guest communications.
Right, like reiterating the coffee situation.
Exactly. Give clear instructions on how to use any appliances. And if you have any specific requests, like asking guests to compost their coffee grounds or dispose of pods properly, state them politely and clearly.
It's about setting those expectations from the start and making it easy for guests to do the right thing.
And remember, guest communication is an ongoing process. Encourage feedback. Ask guests how they enjoyed the coffee, and if there's anything you could improve. That open dialogue can help you fine-tune your approach and make sure you're meeting everyone's needs.
So to wrap things up today, we've really covered a lot of ground when it comes to providing coffee in an Airbnb. From the ethical and environmental considerations to the practical and financial side of things,
Definitely a lot to think about.
what are some of the key takeaways you'd like our listeners to remember as they navigate this whole coffee conundrum?
The most important thing is that there's no one-size-fits-all answer. The best approach is the one that works for you, your property, and your guests. So take the time to really think about your values, your budget, and who your ideal guest is. Then figure out what kind of coffee experience you want to provide and make sure you communicate that clearly to your guests.
And be open to feedback and adapting as you go along. What works for one host might not work for another, and what guests expect today could be different tomorrow.
Absolutely. Stay informed, be adaptable, and always prioritize both guest satisfaction and sustainability.
Well said. We hope this deep dive has given you some food for thought, or should we say coffee for thought, as you continue your journey as an Airbnb superhost.
And remember, we're always here to support you along the way.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, happy hosting.